Well, my brothers and sisters, fellow ketovores and carnivores, welcome to some Kiltz's Carnivore Conversations. I'm really excited to have Josh Dech here to talk about inflammation, irritable bowel syndromes, Crohn's and colitis. And thank you very much for being here, Josh. How are you doing?
It's an absolute pleasure, Robert, to be here. It's a good day. I'm like a happy houseplant when the sun's shining. It's gloomy as all can be today, but that's what the caffeine's for.
Well, I'm an upstate New Yorker from Los Angeles. I've lived in upstate New York for like 30 years, so I know the gloom of the wintertime. But I've been down in Sarasota seasonally for about 6 or 7 years. I go back and forth, but it's a bright blue sky. And but I always say the blue sky is a mindset, and that's one of the most important things.
I'll take that. I was going to say, I was like, that's quite the brag of all things right now.
I'm going to take it as I can get it.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, Josh, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to this inflammatory understanding the health and wellness of gut diseases, and please tell us about yourself.
You know, Rob, it's one of those things where I'd like to say I got here through necessity. I think a lot of us did in the functional medicine space. I've known doctors who left their clinic because it wasn't panning out the way they thought, or they had these realizations where they were keeping people sick, not getting them healthy. And I had the same sort of experience. You know, I've had gut issues my whole life. My parents had gut issues. When I was in my preteens, my mom almost died. She had a perforated bowel. A couple hours later, the surgeon said she would have died at home had she not gone in for emergency surgery that night.
Wow.
So it's been very close to home for a long time. You know, when I was 19, 20 years old, I graduated college as a paramedic. And I worked out in Newfoundland, so far east coast of Canada. And a lot of the same people, a little small town I was working with, pick them up day after day for the same thing, take them to the hospital. They get the same drug or a bigger dose of the same thing or a different drug for the same problem, and they send them back home until one day they stop calling. I watch people just die off in this community because nobody actually got healthy. And there was a chain of events, you know. I ended up getting into personal training, and we had a woman that came to see me, one of my first clients. She's sort of the flagship, I think, that really launched his career to where we are today. She was 57 years old. Breakfast was 17 pills and a shot of insulin. Bedtime was 9 pills and another shot of insulin. High blood pressure, slept with a CPAP machine. She was on disability at work. Like, you've seen these people in your practice just circling the drain. And it was astonishing to me, 2 years of just basic health, nutrition, sleep, stress, and exercise for 45 minutes, 3 days a week. Here she was, this woman on 26 pills a day and disability. After 2 years, she went to the Raw Powerlifting Federation as a weightlifter at 59 and broke a world record.
Whoa.
It was amazing. But that's what the body's capable of. And I realized this. I started diving more into the functional medicine space and what it looks like to heal disease. At this time, it was just a physical process, you know, musculoskeletal, what was going on in people's, like a guy with sciatica for 10 years and nobody could fix it. We got him tuned up in about 3 weeks. His pain was almost gone. So I started seeing this, went back to school, became a nutritionist, dove into the world of gut health. And my first client came to see me one day after doing this for a little while with colitis, ulcerative colitis. And she's like, "Can you help?" I said, "Truthfully, I don't know. My knowledge says it's autoimmune. That's what we've been told, but let's figure it out." And with literally no knowledge of this disease, I went and dove into the literature and started figuring things out. And what she was doing with a very competent, wonderful functional medicine doctor, who I also accredit to my career today, they were working together for 3 years. She was about 30 to 40% managed. We had her 85% of the way in 90 days. Just because we took a different approach, coming from no knowledge, which I think has its own power. And from that day, I started diving into Crohn's and colitis and what drives autoimmune disease. And I've now got the pleasure of working as a physician's consultant. I'm a medical lecturer. I'm the education director and scientific strategist for the root cause for Crohn's colitis. And it's just been this explosion of success going through these diseases from looking at them from a non-conventional lens. And it's just been a wild ride.
What do you think is being missed by the standard medical practices? And what is it you think you saw that makes the difference?
Well, there's basically 3 legs of this table that Crohn's and colitis stand on. Number one, it's an autoimmune condition. So that means your body's attacking itself. There's nothing we can do, and you'll just have to live with it the rest of your life. The second leg that this one stands on is that it's idiopathic. So this means that there's really no known cause. We don't know why it's happening to you. And then the third one is we blame your genetics. We say it's a genetic issue. It kind of just woke up one day. It happened like this. There's nothing we can do. And I started diving into the data, and I thought the math doesn't add up. If we're saying it's this genetic autoimmune condition with no known cause, the numbers didn't make sense. So I started diving into it. Number one, we know in Crohn's disease, the highest prevalence of antibodies is about 55% of the time. We tend to see some of these antibodies.
Mhm.
And in ulcerative colitis, it's 70%, which means 30 to 50% of people aren't having any antibodies at all. And when I dove into what the antibodies were, most of these are not exclusively auto antibodies. So this means they're not attacking your own tissues. They're designed to attack something else. The most common antibody we see in ulcerative colitis, for example, we call P-ANCA. That's little p, capital A-N-C-A. This stands for, the big sciencey word is your perinuclear anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody. So to break that down, it's basically an antibody going after one of your white blood cells called a neutrophil. And I thought, well, what if it's not going after your own blood cell? What if it's going after what that blood cell tried to eat but couldn't digest? So it's going after the belly of the blood cell. We started diving into this more and more and went, wait a minute. There's literature out there already that already makes sense to support this theory. So even these ones may not be attacking you. We know they can be produced from the very medications they use to treat bowel disease. We know that these antibodies can be produced to yeast and fungi or mold or stress or whatever. So the first pillar being autoimmune already didn't make sense. The second one we say, go ahead, Robert. Yeah, jump in.
So what you're saying is the body isn't attacking itself. It's attacking something else that is a foreign particle. And in the process of doing that, it's also damaging your body?
The bystander effect. It's going after something that is close to or inside of one of your own body's own cells or tissues, and therefore it's getting damaged because it's in proximity. We can see this in a lot of different places. Look at LPS, for example, right? Lipopolysaccharides. We can see people with elevated cholesterol levels who have gut issues. Sometimes it's through parasites or whatever else. We can see it in a lot of different areas. We can even see weird things with cholesterol in Alzheimer's disease. But LPS, produced by toxic bacteria in your gut, we know your body actually produces, the liver will produce excess cholesterol to bind to these toxins to neutralize their toxic effects. So even this, so we say, oh, it's a cholesterol problem, we just give you statins. It's actually a defense mechanism that by design is there to protect you, but it happens to junk up some of your natural processes.
So what are some of those particles? Is that really the question? What are those particles that are stimulating your immune system to do its work, essentially?
Exactly. What is it? And this is where we can go back to the basics. I mean, it depends on who you ask and what piece of data you're looking at, but the argument can be made that the last 100 years, we've had 50,000 to 100,000 new chemicals added to our environment, most of which are in our food.
Wow.
So we've got BPAs in plastics, and we know, for example, BPAs, mercury, organophosphates. There's 900 different organophosphate chemicals. They enter the nucleus of the cell. So you're toxic at the dead center of your cells. So what is your body going after? And it's just, I think it can be so simple when we really look at it. But I think something I really face as a criticism from the Crohn's colitis community as a general whole is we want a systematic cure. Create an injection or create an infusion or create a pill that can cure this disease. And we're not looking at the reason why we're all sick. And this is where the individuality comes in.
Drugs equate to dollars.
Always. $800 billion a year of dollars.
And that's our, so you hit on the autoimmune portion of the stool, which let's just cross it out because it's not autoimmune, it's immunologic, right?
Immune mediated.
What's the second leg of that stool?
Yeah, so the second leg is that we say it's a genetic issue. And I want to bounce back from autoimmune. There are organizations now recognizing as immune mediated, which they now put under the umbrella of autoimmune, but immune mediated in itself means it's an overactive, hyperactive immune response. So we already know what's driving it.
So immunologic is kind of the phrase I use,
Mhm.
but imagine all diseases are essentially an allergy,
Yes. Yes.
right?
I think it's bang on.
Okay, because I think when we use the word allergy, we kind of like redness, swelling, joint pain or sniffles. Oh, I've got seasonal allergies, but we don't equate like real diseases with just it's
Correct.
an allergic reaction.
That's right. You're right.
Okay,
And
okay.
that's the thing is, I mean, to say allergy, yeah, would be technically inaccurate. But at the same time, look at Crohn's colitis. We know through what we're seeing clinically, and we have the data, Crohn's and colitis tend to be what's called the Th2 or Th17 dominant response. So these immune pathways, like Th2 is connected to histamines anyways, which is that allergy response. Th17 is a response on a mucosal level inside the intestines. And we're seeing these overactive. So you're going to get these hyper responses.
So if the gut epithelium were on the outside of our body, what would it look like? Would it be red?
It'd be red, it'd be inflamed, it'd probably have hives if you equate it to your skin, it'd be itchy, it'd be irritable, you'd probably have psoriasis and eczema and all these different things. It's the same responses, and we actually connect a lot of these symptoms back to the root drivers.
Interesting. Okay, I cut in, and by the way, thank you. Listen, we want to be didactic and back and forth because this is how I know that I learn because and so many of us don't understand what's Th2 and Th17. Like, what are those things?
Yeah, so if I always think about the immune system kind of like an octopus. And so what we see is there's different arms of this immune system, different immune pathways, Th17, Th2, Th1, Th20. And they basically, each arm of this octopus is designed to do a different thing. They have a different function. They'll react to different stimuli or different invaders or different whatever. And so when we're looking at these things inside the body, Th2, so Th just means T helper. These are your T helper cells. Th2 cells, they're involved in promoting responses against what we call extracellular pathogens. So your parasites and helminths, allergic reactions. And these stimulate these cytokine pathways, these immune pathways. So we'll go back to like ILs, your interleukins and things like that. And so on the other hand, Th17, we can describe as sort of like the angry step sibling of Th2. It's almost a worsened Th2 response. But these Th17 cells, they defend against extracellular bacteria or fungi, and they're on these mucosal layers. So inside your intestines, your mouth, inside vaginal, right? All these like soft, squishy mucosal surfaces. This is where
Mhm.
they react, and they mediate these inflammatory responses. And
So
so,
go ahead.
now go ahead. I was basically
You
what I was
mentioned
saying is
30 to 50% of those with of irritable bowel type symptoms may not have markers for an autoimmune or immunologic disorder.
yeah. So what I'm saying is that, for example, let's go through some of the numbers. So inflammatory bowel disease, we say it's unquestionably autoimmune, which means you have to have auto antibodies, not just antibodies. Your body makes antibodies to all kinds of stuff, but an
Uh-huh.
auto antibody attacks you. So if we look at, for example, are you recording this on video, Robert?
Yes, both.
Yeah. I
Yep,
wonder if
yep,
I could
yep.
even share my screen with you. I pulled up, um, I'll share my screen. I actually pulled up a document or a slide that I made for a recent lecture. Can you see that okay?
We got it.
Beautiful. Okay. So take a look at this. This is the data that I pulled from all kinds of different stuff from PubMed and averaged it out. So our red bar here, this is ulcerative colitis. So for example, this antibody we talked about, 70% of the time, we know it's present in ulcerative colitis, only
Mhm.
10% in Crohn's disease. And you can see that through here. Now, on top of each bar, I put a note of what we also have literature showing can create these antibodies. So in this 70% of Crohn's or ulcerative colitis patients have this antibody, we assume it's an auto antibody, but it can also be produced against certain bacteria, antibiotics,
Hmm.
certain IBD drug therapy like Imuran and methotrexate that we give to treat the very disease can produce these same antibodies. And so if we don't actually have auto antibodies, it is by definition not an autoimmune condition, it's an immune mediated condition. That's the difference.
Okay. And so, but in the diagnosis, and maybe like, let me back up a little bit. You may have spoken a little bit. I mean, what is Crohn's, colitis, and irritable bowel disorders?
Mm. So IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, it's really classified by symptoms. There's really no testing we can do specifically in the lab or through a doctor that can say, well, here's the condition you have. It's basically symptoms. It's an irritable bowel from food, from irritants. You maybe have bloat, gas, constipation, diarrhea, whatever it is. And the shame is a lot of doctors will go in and go, well, it's functional diarrhea or functional constipation. Those are the definition of dysfunction, but we're just calling them, quote, functional disorders
Mhm.
because there's something causing the issue and we don't know what it is. But if we look a little bit more plainly, we use the common sense and the information we get from our own eyes and ears, we can say, well, you're eating Twinkies 7 times a day. You're not sleeping. You're high stress. You're pounding NSAIDs like ibuprofen 2-3 grams a day. You're going to have bowel issues. And so we're not looking beyond this. But then when we go to inflammatory bowel disease, I took an interesting perspective when I first started this and said, what if IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome, and IBD, that's inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's colitis, what if they're actually kind of the same thing, but
Mm,
on a spectrum of severity?
mhm,
Just wanted to pause the question. And so I think of it this way. If you're wearing a pair of shoes without socks and you're going for a walk and that heel starts to get red, what happens? It gets raw and it blisters and it bleeds. That progresses from what was irritated to what is now inflamed and bloody. Well, in
mhm,
Crohn's colitis, what do we see? In Crohn's disease, it's inflammation mouth to anus. You can actually get like perianal abscesses, things like on your butt cheeks outside of the rectum. But you get sores in your mouth, inflammation in your small intestine, a lot of it, sometimes the large intestine, and it goes in patches like a Dalmatian. We call these Peyer's patches, and it tends to be very deep into the tissue.
mm,
Whereas colitis or ulcerative colitis is restricted to the bowel, the large intestine, and it's very surface, like you fell and skinned your knee versus taking a
mhm,
chunk out. And
mhm.
it's typically in strips or patches, or rather than these polka dots like Crohn's. But that's the difference. And so, what causes these expressions is ultimately the question. And if we put them on the same spectrum, let's back this up with data. We know 17 to 20% of all cases of Crohn's colitis, at least in North America, have a previous diagnosis of IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. So, one could argue it was IBS that got worse until it became IBD, rather than, oh, we misdiagnosed it, because that's typically the argument. On the other hand, up to 70% of all North Americans complain of some kind of symptom at least once a week that is congruent with IBS. Meanwhile, only 20-25% have a clinical diagnosis. So we can see this predisposition here, and then we see it worsening. And so the question is, what's really driving it? What becomes what? And I think instead of separating these diseases, we need to look at a grander scheme as a spectrum of severity.
And so I know I grew up with migraine headaches. I couldn't read, and I had bowel troubles for years.
Mhm.
And then they grew into hemorrhoids, bowel bleeding, bladder bleeding for years. I'd get my colonoscopies. It was really, I just took Tums and Rolaids and all the over-the-counter stuff. No one ever gave me a true diagnosis. But what percentage of us are suffering from some bowel disorder that's related to syndrome or disease?
So are we talking a diagnosis or just symptoms?
Well, it could be either one. I'm just curious. I mean, ultimately, aren't all of us somehow having some of these symptoms at some point in our lives?
You could argue everyone will have some symptom at some point in their life. That's almost unquestionable. You eat something you shouldn't, you get stressed out. But per the data, depending on the sample size, we see that 60 to 70% of North Americans complain of a gut issue once a week, such as bloat, constipation, diarrhea, cramping, nausea, vomiting, acid reflux, something like that. So we're on the spectrum. It's like, do I have anxiety or do I get anxious once in a while? Until that trigger becomes so severe, my gut gets so bad, my chemistry gets so bad, I now have an anxiety disorder diagnosed. Because what we're looking for is what's called diagnostic criteria.
Hmm.
Once that heel wears and tears in the shoe and gets so bad it's finally blistered and bleeding, we go, oh, look, you have heel blisteitis. There's your diagnosis, not going back to the beginning. And so once you match the criteria, We treat disease like it's innate to the human biology, like it's part of your DNA. It's a condition you have, and therefore all we can do is take these drugs and manage it. It's crazy.
All right, so let's talk about the genetics. We talked about the immunologic autoimmune part of the stool. Let's get to the genetics before we get to the idiopathic.
Let's do it. So here's the thing about genetics. Genetics do not work in and of themselves, right? They don't work inside of a vacuum. They're influenced by all kinds of factors. They're influenced by, we know through the study of nutrigenomics, how nutrients, your vitamins and minerals and amino acids and all these things impact. We know they're impacted by things like stress. Let's go back to organophosphates, the toxins, chemicals we talked about. They actually mutate genes in DNA. We know that these happen. And so what we're saying is, well, it's just a genetic issue. But here's a fun fact for you. Let's look at Crohn's and colitis. Statistically speaking, familial history, it's 24 to 28% of the time that there's any family history or gene association.
Wow.
So if we have a genetic correlation less than 30% of the time, why are we brushing every condition and say, oh, it's a genetic condition? It's not. And then if we know your genes don't act in and of themselves, something has to be driving this. So here's how I picture this. If you're standing outside of a factory, let's talk Ford Motor Company. You're standing outside the Ford factory. On one end, you see a bunch of scrap metal come in, bunch of bits and chemicals. You can't see what's going on inside that factory, but you know at the exit door, it's a car. That makes sense to you. That factory must produce the car. But if you send a bunch of junk and plastic in, and you know that factory's on fire and one of the walls is broken down, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a mechanical engineer to figure out that car is probably not going to come out looking like it should because the factory itself is all mangled. And so what we do inside of our body, we have certain genes that are responsible for certain things, common ones associated with bowel disease, like your IRGMs, IL-23Rs, your HLA genes, your NOD2 for Crohn's. We see these correlations. But if you're getting bad inputs for these genetics, you're toxic, you're microbial imbalances, you're not eating very well, you're high stress, all these other things, then these genes, like the factory, are not going to perform like they should. And therefore, we end up with a messy end product. See, these genes regulate your immune responses on a mucosal level. They regulate or react to certain microbes. They increase or decrease inflammation and manage a lot of this stuff. Well, how can they manage microbes and inflammation and immune responses if their inputs are bad? Therefore, you're going to have bad outputs such as elevated or wacky immune responses, such as bacteria that doesn't get checked and regulated. And now we have infections and inflammation. So genetics with less than a 30% correlation do not act in a vacuum. There are other factors that impact them. Therefore, it can't possibly just be genetic. And if I consult this wound one more for you, Robert.
Please.
Look at North America. They are the gut disease capital of the world. We know bowel disease is primarily an industrialized issue. So Canada, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand is where the vast majority of it is in the world. Depending on the data sets, 30 to 50% of all cases of Crohn's colitis come from North America, which is less than 5% of the globe. So we're also the gut disease capital of the world. And this has happened. We've seen an increase in cases, about 3,000% in the last 75 years. So to just call it genetic, I think is asinine. I think it doesn't make any sense.
Well, let's touch on idiopathic. And I always say idiopathic means we're idiots.
I agree. I love that. We need to look. I think idiopathic just comes from ignorance between you and I.
We're not willing to take the time to imagine the possibility of something else is going on. So 33,000% increase. It's a North American disease. It sounds like it's a fast food, high pressure lifestyle of just willy-nilly putting anything and everything in and on our bodies and immersing ourselves in things that may not be right for us. Would you give us your opinion and what's led you down the rabbit hole?
Well, here's the thought. Again, it was just distilling the information down differently. And I get a lot of flack. So where'd you get your degree from? Like, I don't have one. I just figured it out. You know, there's that guy, I forget his name, who went through the ocean. He wanted to restore coral and coral reef. And he's like, I got a project and got an idea. And the marine biologist said, go back to school, get a PhD, do all this research, come back in 9 years, and then we'll talk. And he's like, screw you guys. I'm just going to figure it out. And he did. And he's restored hundreds of kilometers of coral reef back to the ocean. You don't need a degree. And I think the irony is that the people teaching this stuff aren't solving the problem the way we are anyway. So why do I want to learn from them? I think the information's wrong. And so if we look at idiopathic, we say it's no known cause. That's what you're taught in school.
Right.
But we've seen cases go from 15 per 100,000 in North America in the 1950s to 463 per 100,000 today. That's a 3,000% jump. And so we have to look at is a few different things. There's some great work from Justin Sonnenberg and Erica Sonnenberg from Stanford, and they're talking about generational dysbiosis. Now, if we look at your gut microbiome, this ecosystem, right, this is upwards of 100 trillion microbes. You got viruses and parasites and fungi and bacteria, all these things that live together in an ecosystem. It's a community. It's well balanced, and it takes care of itself. It's self-sustaining like a pond. Right? You have all this life that just takes care of each other and cleans up the junk and converts it to good stuff. And bing, bang, boom, you have an ecosystem. What we're seeing, we can demonstrate in mice. It would take hundreds of years in people. But what they're seeing is that as we have bacteria and say great-great-grandmother, let's just for argument's sake, great-grandmother has 1,000 microbes. Now she's in the 1800s, right before the Industrial Revolution. Now we have some chemicals and mercuries and aluminums and stuff being added to our soil, and chemicals are starting to get added to clothing. Cool. Mm-hmm. So she gives birth to grandma. Well, through this process of inducing chemicals and microbial killers, grandma now only gets 800 microbes. That's all great grandmother had to give her. Microbes can't come from nowhere. They have to be passed down. It's like plants. You can't plant a garden and have things grow from nothing. You have to have seeds there ahead of time to produce a new species. This is where this comes from. And then now here we are, early 1900s, introducing things like penicillin, right? We're right in the World War I and II, where we're having organophosphates produced as chemical warfare, which ironically enough, like chlorpyrifos, the chemical, is now being sprayed on our food, which the Nazis explored for warfare. So fun fact. But these chemicals now come in. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and mustard gas was used to treat cancer.
Right. Yeah. Look at all this stuff. Thalidomide. Right? Yeah. For pregnant women and sickness that cause birth defects. We don't know what we're doing. We're messing with nature. We're not that smart. It's the hubris that kills us. So we have these chemicals come in. Grandma, who has 800 microbes, now has a bunch destroyed. She gives birth to mom, who gets 600, who then, through the process of more introduction of chemicals and junk food and whatever, now gives birth to you, get 400. Your kids get 200. This is generational dysbiosis, and it's exponentially getting worse. There was about 900 pesticides approved for use in the 90s. There's almost 20,000 approved for use in North America today. It is getting much, much worse. Our defenses are down.
So all of these chemicals that we've introduced, much of it from nature, but then much of it we've created the changes in these chemicals, which also probably mutate the microbes. And I'm wondering how much of the mutation of the microbes, not just the numbers or type, may have a factor on increasing the inflammatory reactions in the gut.
That is an amazing question. I mean, if you look at all these chemicals, not just like the preservatives and food coloring, we know there's issues with those already. But look what the chemicals do, how they bind to cellular DNA. They can bind inside the nucleus, and they get in there and attack, like we talked about circling back to the beginning, where these connect to your tissues and they bind to the tissues. Your body tries to attack them, and the immune response, because it can't get rid of them, gets higher and higher and higher. And now we go, look, it's autoimmune. When really your body just had to recruit more and more soldiers to try to do the job. And it's a hyperactive immune mediated response because you have toxins you can't get rid of.
Okay, so we've got this three stool of gastric inflammatory disorders. Autoimmune disease we've slashed out, idiopathic we've kind of slashed out, and genetics we've slashed out in general as the cause. So where do we put this the top of the stool, right? The thing we sit on, and have something that has foundational properties that'll help us heal our brothers and sisters?
That is such a great question. I know it's so easy to talk doom and gloom, but let's talk about what to do about it.
Yeah, that's what we want to hear. Dr. Rob Kiltz, another beautiful, spectacular day. And I just want to send thanks to all of those for watching the newest episode of Carnivore Conversations. Be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming platforms to gain access to the full 1-hour episode. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more to come. God bless.